3 men had tried to harvest the wheat at Red Hollow Ranch. All 3 had failed. The first collapsed from what Doc Morrison called heat exhaustion, but the look in the man's eyes when he came to was one of pure animal terror. He packed his things and was gone before sunrise, never looking back. The second, a hardened worker named Jake, lasted a week. He was found wandering near the creek, his hands shaking, muttering about whispers in the grain. He took half his pay and practically ran back to town. The third man, Dutch Hanrahan, was a giant, a man known throughout the territory for his grit. They found him at the edge of the eastern field, curled into a ball, his face pale as milk. He wasn't muttering, he was screaming. He'd seen a shadow, he said, a shadow that wasn't cast by the sun. So when Annie Rose Dillard, a woman no bigger than a whisper with worn-out boots and eyes that held the ghosts of 1,000 hard miles, stepped off the supply wagon and asked for the job, everyone laughed. The remaining ranch hands, old Pete Garrison and the Wilson twins, they just shook their heads. But Coulter Hayes, the widowed owner of Red Hollow, didn't laugh. He was a man drowning in golden wheat and silent grief, and he was desperate. He looked at the woman's calloused hands, the stubborn set of her jaw, and saw something beyond her slight frame. He saw a fight. He gave her a chance. It was a decision that would unearth a secret that had been buried for 5 long years, a secret watered with tears and sealed in blood. A secret that would force him to question everything he thought he knew about his land, his past, and the woman he had loved and lost. Because Annie Rose Dillard wasn't just looking for work. She was looking for answers. And she had come to the one place on Earth where they were buried. The sun bled across the Montana sky, painting the ranch in hues of rust and gold. It was a beautiful, lonely place. Coulter Hayes felt that loneliness in his bones, a constant ache that had settled in the day he buried his wife Sarah. 5 years. 5 years of silence in a house that used to be filled with her laughter and the scent of baking bread. Now, it just smelled like dust and memories. His wedding ring was a permanent fixture on his hand, a cold, silver reminder of a promise he still felt bound to. The ranch itself was another promise. 3 generations of Hayes men had poured their sweat and blood into this soil. His grandfather had built the first cabin. His father had raised the big barn. Coulter had inherited it all, the 200 acres of prime land and the crushing weight of the banknote his father had left behind. The wheat was his only hope. It stood tall and thick, a golden ocean promising a bounty that could save them. But it was a hungry ocean. It had already swallowed 3 good men, and now it was waiting for Annie. He watched from the porch as old Pete showed her to the small private room at the end of the bunkhouse. He saw the Wilson twins, Matt and Mark, exchange a look that said it all. She won't last the day. Coulter wasn't so sure. There was a stillness about her, a purpose in her stride. When she had looked him in the eye and said, "Strength isn't always about size, Mr. Hayes. Sometimes it's about refusing to quit." He'd felt a jolt. It was something Sarah might have said. That evening, he saw Annie walk to the fence line, her hands resting on the top rail as she stared out at the fields. She wasn't just looking. She was studying, reading the land with an expert's eye. Then, she turned and headed back to the bunkhouse, her gaze briefly meeting his across the growing dark. "It's beautiful land, Mr. Hayes," she called out, her voice soft but clear. "Your family built something to be proud of." Most hands just saw the work. They saw the sun and the sweat and the ache in their backs. She saw the legacy. Coulter stayed on that porch long after she'd gone inside. He could hear the low murmur of voices from the main bunkhouse, the skepticism of his men. Tomorrow would tell the tale. But as he finally went inside, into the quiet, hollow rooms of his house, he had a strange feeling. A feeling he hadn't had in 5 years. He was hoping she'd succeed. What he didn't know was that Annie's success wouldn't just be about the harvest. Her survival at Red Hollow Ranch would depend on something far more dangerous than a sharp scythe and a hot sun. It would depend on keeping her own secrets buried, even as she started digging up his. Dawn broke cold and clear. Annie was at the equipment shed before anyone else, her worn leather gloves already on. They were cracked and stitched, the story of a hard life written on the palms. She moved with an eerie quiet, her eyes constantly scanning, not just the fields, but the tree line, the shadows by the barn. It wasn't the caution of a farmhand. It was the vigilance of a soldier. Coulter handed her a scythe. We work in teams, cut clean, bundle tight, and keep moving. She tested the blade with a practiced thumb, a gesture so familiar it was like watching a musician tune an instrument. She took her place at the edge of the field, a lone, small figure against an endless sea of gold. Then the work began. The whisper of blades was the only sound. Pete and the Wilson twins worked with brute force, their muscles straining. But Annie was different. She moved with a fluid, deadly grace. Her scythe was an extension of her body, each swing a perfect, efficient arc. She wasn't fighting the wheat. She was dancing with it. By mid-morning, the sun was a merciless hammer in the sky. Pete was stopping to stretch his back. The twins were gasping for water. Annie never stopped. She just kept moving, a steady, relentless rhythm. And she was humming, an old hymn, "Come thou fount of every blessing." The melody was soft, almost a ghost on the wind, but it had a strange effect. It seemed to cut through the oppressive heat, to make the impossible work feel bearable. During the noon break, Matt Wilson finally broke the ice. "Where'd you learn to work like that?" he asked, his earlier skepticism replaced by grudging awe. Annie took a sip of water, her eyes distant. "My father," she said simply. "He taught me that work was a conversation with the land." She paused, and for a second, a shadow passed over her face. "He said you have to listen to what it's telling you." "Was he a farmer?" Coulter asked, sensing the grief behind her words. She nodded, her fingers absently picking at a loose stitch on her glove. "We had a place, Nebraska, along the Platte River." "What happened?" Pete asked, his voice gentle. "A flood," she said. The word was flat, empty. "Took the house, the barn, took my family." The men fell silent. Every one of them knew the brutal whims of nature, but as Coulter looked at her, he saw more than just the grief of a natural disaster. He saw the haunted look of a survivor of something else entirely. The story felt incomplete, a carefully constructed wall to hide whatever was behind it. And he was right. The flood was a lie. A simple, tragic story to cover a truth so violent and terrifying she couldn't even speak its name. The truth hadn't been washed away by a river. It had been burned to the ground by men she was still running from, and one of them was closer than she could ever imagine. The afternoon work resumed with a new tension. The sky was turning a bruised purple on the western horizon. A storm was coming, fast and mean. "We need to pick up the pace," Coulter yelled, his eyes on the clouds. "If that rain hits before we get this section bundled, we'll lose it all." This was the breaking point, the pressure that had sent other men running. Coulter watched Annie, expecting to see a flicker of panic. Instead, he saw her eyes narrow with focus. Her movements became even more precise, faster. She started calling out orders, not with arrogance, but with the calm authority of a field commander. "Matt, Mark, work in a staggered line. Pete, focus on the low ground. Mr. Hayes, we need to create a firebreak of cut wheat to the east." The men didn't question her. They just did it. Her logic was undeniable, her strategy flawless. She saw the field not as a single challenge, but as a map with tactical points to be secured. They worked like a machine, a single unit under her command. They cut and bundled with a speed Coulter wouldn't have thought possible. The wind began to whip the stalks, and the first fat drops of rain splattered against the dust. They were in a race against God, and somehow they were winning. As they hauled the last wagon load into the safety of the barn, the heavens opened up. The rain came down in a solid, blinding sheet. They stood in the barn doorway, soaked and exhausted, but victorious. "Thank you," Coulter said, his voice filled with a respect that went beyond her work ethic. He was looking at her, really looking at her, and realizing this woman was a complete mystery. She just smiled, a tired but triumphant expression that lit up her dirt-streaked face. "Thank you for the chance." That night, Coulter couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the afternoon in his mind. Her calm under pressure, her strategic commands. Where did a simple farm girl learn battlefield tactics? The story about the flood felt thinner than ever. He got up and walked into his study. He hadn't been in here much since Sarah died. It was her space. He ran his hand over her old roll-top desk, the silence of the room amplifying the questions in his head. His fingers brushed against a small, locked drawer. Sarah had always kept the key on a ribbon around her neck. After she passed, he'd put the key away in a box of her things. He'd never had the heart to open it. Tonight was different. He found the key, a small, ornate silver thing. The lock clicked open with a soft metallic sigh. Inside, there was only one thing, a small, leather-bound journal. He opened it. It wasn't recipes or household notes. The first page was dated just a week before her death. The handwriting was hers, but it was frantic, scared. "He knows. HB knows I have the proof. He said he'd stop at nothing. I have to hide it. I have to protect Coulter. No one can know, not even Pete. The land is all that matters. The deal must be stopped." Coulter's blood ran cold. HB? A deal? Proof? He flipped through the pages. More frantic entries. Mentions of secret meetings. Threats. Fear. This wasn't the journal of a woman content with her life. It was the journal of a woman who believed she was about to be murdered. The last entry was just 2 words. Miller's Creek. That's where they had found her. She'd slipped, they said. Hit her head on a rock. A tragic accident. But it wasn't an accident. His wife had been murdered. And for 5 years, he had been living a lie. He slammed the journal shut, his mind reeling. And in the bunkhouse, Annie Rose Dillard lay awake, one hand resting on the hilt of a small, wicked-looking knife she kept hidden under her pillow. She wasn't thinking about the harvest. She was thinking about the name of the man who had destroyed her life, the man she was hunting. A man with the initials HBA strange new rhythm settled over the ranch. On the surface, it was about the harvest. They worked from sunup to sundown, a well-oiled team. But underneath, a silent, secret war was being waged. Coulter was now looking at his own past with the eyes of a detective, seeing shadows where he once saw memories. Annie was watching everyone, trusting no one, her quiet grace a mask for the coiled tension within her. One morning, Coulter came out to find his favorite work shirt, which had a long tear in the sleeve, draped over his porch chair. The tear was gone. In its place was a line of stitches so small and perfect, they were nearly invisible. He knew it was Annie's work. It was the kind of quiet care Sarah used to show. But when he put on the shirt, he felt something in the mended pocket. It wasn't a button or a stray coin. It was a small, flat piece of wood, carved into the shape of a bird. A sparrow, maybe. The wood was dark, unfamiliar, and the carving was intricate, clearly the work of a skilled hand. He found her sharpening scythes by the barn. "Morning, Miss Dillard. Thank you for the shirt." She just nodded, not looking up from her work. Seemed ashamed to let it go to waste. He held out the small wooden bird. "I found this in the pocket." For the first time since she'd arrived, he saw a flicker of raw panic in her eyes. It was there and gone in a heartbeat, replaced by a careful blankness. She took the bird from his hand, her fingers closing around it tightly. "It's just a trinket," she said, her voice a little too casual. "Something to remember my brother by." Another piece of her story, another detail that felt both true and completely false at the same time. Coulter let it go, but he filed it away. The bird, the knife he'd glimpsed under her pillow one evening, her tactical knowledge. The pieces were starting to form a picture, and it was the picture of a woman at war. That evening, the conversations on the porch began. Hesitant at first, they were two guarded people circling each other's secrets. He didn't mention the journal. She didn't mention the bird. They talked about the weather, the wheat, the land. One night, he brought out a block of maple and a carving knife. As they talked, his hands were busy. He was a skilled woodworker, a craft learned from his grandfather. He watched her hair, how stray strands of auburn would come loose and whip across her face as she worked. A few nights later, he handed her the finished piece, a beautiful, handcrafted wooden comb. She took it with a reverence that surprised him. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's been a long time since anyone made something just for me." She pulled the pins from her hair, letting it fall around her shoulders, and began to comb through it with the gift. The simple, intimate act sent a jolt through him that had nothing to do with gratitude. "Tell me about your family," he said, his voice softer than he intended. She told him the story of the flood again, the gentle father, the creative mother, the bright-eyed younger brother. It was a well-rehearsed tragedy. But as she spoke, her hand went to her pocket, where Coulter knew she kept that strange wooden bird, a nervous habit, a tell. He decided to offer a piece of his own truth, a breadcrumb to see if she would follow. "Sarah, my wife, she would have liked you." It was the first time he'd said her name to Annie. "Tell me about her," Annie said, her voice gentle. She was laughter, he began, and he told Annie about the roses, the way she could find joy in the smallest things. But he didn't tell her about the journal. He didn't tell her his wife had died afraid and alone. He was still protecting a memory that he now knew was a carefully constructed fiction. He was testing her, and she was testing him. Two spies in a land of ghosts. The next day, Martha, the cook from town, came down with a fever. Without a word, Annie took over the kitchen, and that's when Coulter made his move. He went into the study and took Sarah's leather-bound recipe book from the shelf. He brought it to the kitchen and handed it to her. "These were my wife's," he said, watching her face closely. "I thought you might find them useful." Annie took the book as if it were a holy relic. She opened it, her fingers tracing Sarah's elegant script. Molasses cookies, beef stew to warm a man's bones. She looked up at him, her eyes shining. She must have been a wonderful cook. She was, Coulter said. She believed feeding people was a way of caring for them. He watched as Annie turned the pages. He was waiting for her to get to the back. Because last night, after he'd read Sarah's journal again, he'd noticed something else. Something tucked between the pages for apple pie and sourdough starter. It was a map, a hand-drawn map of the eastern fields leading to Miller's Creek, and on the map, next to an old dead oak tree, Sarah had drawn a small star and written a single word: proof. Annie's fingers slowly, deliberately, turned page after page. She was getting closer. Coulter held his breath. Suddenly, she stopped. She looked up from the book, her green eyes locking with his. But she wasn't looking at the map. She was pointing to a note Sarah had written in the margin of a cornbread recipe. "Add honey when the men have worked especially hard," she read aloud. "It lifts their spirits." She smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that reached her eyes. She sounds like she was a very kind woman. She had skipped right over the map, or had she? Was it a deliberate move, a signal that she wasn't ready to show her hand? That night, she made the beef stew from Sarah's book. It was delicious. It tasted of home. It tasted of a life he thought he'd lost forever. After supper, they sat on the porch. The recipe book lay on the small table between them, a silent testament to the woman who connected them both. And that's when Pete Garrison came running from the barn, his face pale with alarm. "Coulter, you need to see this!" They followed him out to the eastern fence line. In the fading light, they saw them, a straight, perfect line of them, marching across their best wheat field, wooden stakes, driven deep into the Hayes family soil. Each one was branded with the seal of the Montana Territory Railroad Commission. The invasion had begun, but it was worse than Coulter could have imagined, because standing beside the lead surveyor, pointing out the line he wanted, was a man in a fine city suit, a man with a cold smile and dead eyes, a man Coulter recognized from an old photograph in Sarah's journal, and a man Annie recognized as the devil himself, the man who had burned her home and destroyed her family. Mr. Herbert Blackwood. Panic seized Annie's heart, a cold, familiar dread that stole her breath. Blackwood, here. The architect of her ruin, the ghost she'd been chasing for 3 agonizing years, was standing on Hayes' land as if he owned it. She felt the blood drain from her face and took a half-step back, her hand instinctively going to the knife she'd strapped to her ankle beneath her trousers. Coulter didn't notice her reaction. He was staring at Blackwood with a different kind of horror. This was H.B. from Sarah's journal, the man she had feared, the man who had threatened her, the man who had murdered her, and here he was, planning to carve up the very land she had died to protect. "Mr. Hayes," Blackwood said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. He tipped his hat, a gesture of mock politeness that was more insulting than an open threat. "Herbert Blackwood, Railroad Commission. I trust you received our correspondence." "I got your letters," Coulter said, his voice a low growl. Pete and the Wilson twins had gathered behind him, their faces grim. They could feel the tension, thick and poisonous as smoke. "Excellent," Blackwood smiled. "Then you know our offer is more than generous. We require a corridor through this eastern section, including full rights to Miller's Creek. A formality, really. Progress cannot be stopped." He said the word progress, as if it were a holy creed. It was then that Blackwood's eyes landed on Annie. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A flicker of confusion, of recognition, crossed his face. He looked at her as one might look at a ghost. "And who is this?" he asked, his gaze sharp and probing. Before Annie could speak, Coulter stepped slightly in front of her, a subtle, protective gesture. "This is Miss Dillard. She works for me." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent, chilling interrogation. Annie met his stare, her terror warring with a cold, rising fury. She would not break. She would not run. Not again. He finally turned back to Coulter, dismissing her. "Be that as it may, we will begin our full survey at week's end. I expect your signed agreement by then. Don't make this difficult, Hayes. We have the full backing of the territorial government." He gestured to the stakes, which now looked like tombstones marking the death of the ranch. With a final, parting glance at Annie, Blackwood and his men mounted their horses and rode away, leaving a toxic silence in their wake. "What was that about?" Pete asked, looking from Coulter to Annie. "That man looked at you like he'd seen the dead walk." I just have one of those faces, I guess," Annie stammered, her mind racing. He'd recognized her. He wasn't sure, but the seed of suspicion was planted. She had to be more careful than ever. That night, the ranch house became a war room. Coulter finally told Pete about Sarah's journal. He laid it on the kitchen table, the pages open to the frantic, fearful entries. He told him about HB, the threats, the secret map. Pete's weathered face, usually a mask of stoicism, crumpled with grief and guilt. "I knew it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I knew her death wasn't right. She was so scared those last few weeks. I should have pressed her. I should have done more." "We'll do more now, Pete," Coulter said, his jaw set like granite. "We'll fight them." Annie listened, her heart pounding. Their fight was her fight now, more than they could ever know. She had to help them, not just for the ranch, but for herself. Stopping Blackwood was the only justice her family would ever get. "He mentioned Miller's Creek," Annie said, her voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside. "The water rights are the key. In Nebraska, water rights were often tied to the original land grants, not just sections of the property. If we can find your grandfather's original deed." It was a long shot, but it was a plan. For the next 3 days, They turned Coulter's study upside down. They pored over dusty ledgers, brittle maps, and legal documents that hadn't seen the light of day in 50 years. And Annie found it. Tucked inside an old family Bible, a folded, yellowed document, the original territorial land grant for Red Hollow Ranch. She spread it out on the table. The language was archaic, the ink faded, but the clause was unmistakable. The water rights for all tributaries, including the waterway known as Miller's Creek, are indivisible from the whole of the property herein described. They cannot be sold, sectioned, or transferred separately. It was a bombshell, a legal shield forged by Coulter's grandfather a half-century ago. Blackwood couldn't just buy the eastern section and take the water. To get the creek, he had to get the entire ranch, and Coulter would never sell. They had him. They had a fighting chance. But as they celebrated their small victory, a new, more terrifying thought wormed its way into Coulter's mind. He looked at the map Sarah had drawn, the one in the recipe book, the one leading to the old oak by the creek. Proof, she had written. What if the proof wasn't just papers? Blackwood was a ruthless man. He'd murdered Sarah to silence her. What if the proof she hid was something more tangible, something she knew he would come looking for? He looked at Annie, who was studying the old land grant with fierce concentration. She was brilliant. She was a fighter. She was also, he realized with a sinking heart, a complete stranger. She had a past she was hiding, a past that was somehow tied to the very man they were fighting. Could he trust her? Was her arrival at Red Hollow, at this exact moment, a coincidence? Or was she a pawn in a much larger game? The doubt was a poison, clouding his judgment. He wanted to trust her. He was starting to feel something for her that he hadn't felt for anyone since Sarah. But his wife's ghost stood between them, whispering warnings. He decided he had to know for sure. He had to go to Miller's Creek. He had to find what Sarah had hidden. He would go alone, at night. He wouldn't tell Annie. He wouldn't even tell Pete. It was a mistake that would nearly cost him his life. Because he wasn't the only one who had figured out what Sarah's map meant. Someone else was watching, someone who had been on the ranch all along, hiding in plain sight. Someone who knew all of Red Hollow's secrets, and they were waiting for him at the creek. The moon was a sliver of bone in the black sky. Coulter moved through the darkness like a wraith, his boots silent on the damp earth. The air was cold, filled with the scent of pine and the sound of rushing water from Miller's Creek. Every snapping twig, every hoot of a distant owl sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through him. He carried a shovel and a lantern. Its light shuddered so it cast only a dim glow at his feet. He found the old, lightning-scarred oak tree from Sarah's map without any trouble. It stood like a gnarled sentinel, guarding the secrets of the dead. He set down the lantern and began to dig at the base of the tree, where the roots formed a dark, hollow space. The dirt was soft, recently disturbed. A cold dread washed over him. Someone had been here before. His shovel struck something hard with a dull thud. Not a rock. Metal. He dropped to his knees, clawing at the dirt with his bare hands. He pulled it free. It was a small, tin box, rusted at the hinges. Sarah's sewing box. He pried it open. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was not a stack of documents as he had expected. It was a single object, a silver locket, ornate and clearly expensive. It wasn't his. He had never seen it before. He opened the locket. On one side was a miniature portrait of a handsome, smiling man he didn't recognize. On the other side, a tiny, expertly folded piece of paper. He carefully unfolded it. It was a receipt from a bank in Helena, a receipt for a deposit of $5,000, made out to Sarah Hayes, dated the day before she died. Coulter's world tilted on its axis. $5,000. It was a fortune. Where did Sarah get that kind of money? And who was the man in the locket? A floorboard creaked behind him. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. A figure stepped out from behind a thicket of trees, holding a heavy ranch rifle. The moonlight caught the man's face, and Coulter stared in disbelief. It was Pete. Old, loyal Pete Garrison. His face was a mask of sorrow and grim resolve. "You shouldn't have come here, Coulter," Pete said, his voice heavy. "Pete! What is this? What's going on?" Coulter stammered, scrambling to his feet. "Some things are better left buried," Pete said, his knuckles white on the stock of the rifle. "I was loyal to her. I'm still loyal to her. I promised I would protect her secret." "Secret? What secret? Pete, she was murdered!" Coulter yelled, his voice cracking. "Murdered?" Pete let out a short, bitter laugh. "No, son. She wasn't murdered." He took a step closer, the rifle steady in his hands. "Sarah wasn't trying to stop the railroad. She was trying to make a deal with them behind your back. She was going to sell the water rights, take the money, and leave you." The words hit Coulter like a physical blow. He couldn't breathe. No, you're lying." "Am I?" Pete gestured with the rifle barrel toward the locket in Coulter's hand. "The man in that locket is Arthur Vance. He was Blackwood's partner. Sarah was in love with him. That $5,000 was her first payment. She was going to leave with him, leave the ranch, and leave you." Coulter stared at the locket, at the smiling face of the stranger who had stolen his wife's heart. The journal, the frantic entries. It wasn't fear of Blackwood. It was the fear of being caught. She wasn't a martyr. She was a traitor. "Her death," Coulter whispered. "It was an accident. Just like they said," Pete explained, his voice softening. "She was meeting Vance here by the creek. They argued. He didn't want to wait anymore. She got cold feet. She tried to run. She slipped on the wet rocks and she hit her head. Vance panicked and fled. I found her. I knew if the truth came out, it would destroy you. Destroy her memory. So I buried the box. I let you believe she was a saint." The silence that followed was broken only by the rushing water of the creek, a sound that would now forever be tied to betrayal. Coulter felt a hollow space open up inside him, an emptiness that consumed all the grief, all the anger, all the love he'd held for Sarah. It was all built on a lie. "Why now, Pete?" Coulter asked, his voice dead. "Why try to stop me?" "Because of her," Pete said, his gaze flicking toward the direction of the ranch house. "Annie, she's smart, too smart. She started asking the right questions, finding things she shouldn't. I knew she'd lead you here eventually. I can't let Sarah's name be ruined. I gave her my word." Suddenly, a twig snapped in the woods to their left. Both men froze. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was Annie. She was holding the small, sharp knife from under her pillow. Her eyes, glowing in the moonlight, were not fixed on Coulter or Pete. They were fixed on the tin box on the ground. "I knew it," she whispered, her voice a mixture of triumph and rage. "I knew she had to have it." "Have what?" Coulter asked, completely lost. She ignored him, her eyes still locked on the box. "When Blackwood's men burned our farm, they were looking for something. My father had uncovered proof of his land fraud scheme. He'd given a copy of that proof to an associate for safekeeping, a woman he'd met at a farmer's grange who was also suspicious of the railroad's dealings in Montana, a woman named Sarah Hayes." Annie finally looked at Coulter, her expression one of grim pity. "Your wife wasn't a traitor, Coulter. She was a hero. She was working with my father. That $5,000 wasn't a payoff. It was my father's life savings, given to Sarah to fund the legal fight against Blackwood. The man in the locket wasn't her lover. It was my father." She pointed a trembling finger at the locket. "That's Timothy Dillard, and the proof he gathered, the proof that cost him his life, is in the false bottom of that sewing box." Before anyone could react, another voice cut through the night, a cold, menacing voice from the shadows behind Annie. "She's right, you know." Herbert Blackwood stepped into the clearing, flanked by two of his hired thugs. He was holding a pistol, and it was aimed directly at Annie's heart. "A very clever woman your wife was, Hayes. And this one," he sneered at Annie, "is just as troublesome as her father. I should have made sure you were in the fire with the rest of them." He took a step closer, his eyes glinting. "Now, give me the box. The real story dies tonight, along with all of you." The clearing at Miller's Creek became a tinderbox ready to explode. 4 people, 4 versions of the truth, and 1 gun that held all the power. Blackwood's pistol was rock-steady, aimed at Annie. "The box," he repeated, his voice dangerously low. Pete was the first to move. In a stunning act of redemption, he swung the heavy ranch rifle not at Coulter, but at Blackwood's men. "Run, Coulter! Get Annie out of here!" he roared. One of Blackwood's thugs fired. The shot echoed through the trees. Pete grunted and staggered back, clutching his shoulder, blood blooming dark on his shirt. But he didn't fall. He brought the rifle to bear and fired back, buying them precious seconds. Coulter reacted on pure instinct. He grabbed Annie's arm and yanked her behind the massive trunk of the old oak tree. Blackwood's pistol shot splintered the bark where her head had just been. "We have to get the box," Annie hissed, her eyes wild with adrenaline. "It's everything. We have to stay alive," Coulter shot back. He peered around the tree. Pete was on one knee trying to reload, his face a mask of pain. Blackwood and his men were advancing, using the trees for cover. They were trapped. "I can create a diversion," Annie said, her voice dropping to a whisper. She pulled 2 objects from the small satchel she always carried, the carved wooden sparrow and a small leather pouch. "Give me your lantern." "What are you going to do?" "Something my mother taught me," she said, her hands moving with deft, practiced speed. She opened the pouch, which was filled with a fine, dark powder, and stuffed a small amount into the hollowed-out carving of the bird. She tore a strip from her shirt hem to fashion a makeshift fuse. It wasn't a memory of her mother. It was a technique taught by a revolutionary she'd known in the Badlands, a man who believed fire was the only language tyrants understood. She lit the fuse with a match from Coulter's lantern. "When I throw this, run for the creek bed. Don't look back." She scrambled to the edge of the tree cover and hurled the small wooden bird toward a thick, dry patch of brush near Blackwood's men. The bird landed, and for a second, nothing happened. Blackwood laughed. "What was that, little girl? Trying to scare us with your toys?" Then the bird exploded. It wasn't a massive blast, but it was intensely bright and loud. The flash powder ignited the dry brush with a ferocious whoosh. A wall of fire and disorienting smoke erupted between them and their attackers. Blackwood's men cried out in surprise, stumbling back from the heat. "Now!" Annie screamed. Coulter didn't hesitate. He scooped up the tin box and lunged for the creek bed, pulling Annie along with him. They scrambled down the muddy bank, the icy water of Miller's Creek soaking them to the bone. Gunshots rang out behind them, bullets kicking up water and zinging off the rocks around them. They were exposed, running in the open water. They wouldn't make it. Suddenly, a new volley of shots erupted from the woods on the far side of the creek, not from a pistol, but from the powerful boom of at least 2 rifles. Blackwood's men yelled in pain and surprise. One of them fell. Blackwood cursed, firing blindly into the dark before retreating back into the woods. Coulter and Annie huddled behind a large boulder in the middle of the creek, hearts hammering. 2 figures emerged from the trees on the far bank, rifles held at the ready. It was the Wilson twins, Matt and Mark. "We saw you head out, Coulter," Matt called out. "Figured you might need some company." "And it's a good thing we followed," Mark added, his eyes scanning the woods where Blackwood had disappeared. "Pete? He's hit, but he's alive!" Coulter shouted back, his voice hoarse with relief and disbelief. They had a chance. The tide had turned. They scrambled out of the creek and rushed to Pete's side. The bullet had gone clean through his shoulder. It was bad, but he would live. "The box!" Pete gasped, looking at Coulter. "Is it true, what she said?" Coulter looked at Annie, then back at the loyal man who had tried to protect a lie to save him from pain. "It's true, Pete. Sarah was a hero." Annie knelt and quickly worked the tin box. She found the tiny latch for the false bottom. It clicked open. Inside, it was all there. The original documents detailing Blackwood's land fraud, sworn affidavits from farmers he'd cheated, and a signed confession from his former partner, Arthur Vance. the man Pete thought was Sarah's lover, implicating Blackwood in bribery, extortion, and the fire that had killed Annie's family. Vance, it turned out, had a conscience after all, and he had trusted Sarah Hayes to bring the truth to light. They had him. The proof was real. It was in their hands. "He won't get far," Mark Wilson said, reloading his rifle with a grim click. "We know these woods better than he does." "No," Annie said, standing up. Her eyes were burning with a cold fire Coulter had never seen before. "He's not just going to be caught." She looked at Coulter, her expression hard as forged steel. "He's going to face justice, and I'm going to be the one to deliver it." The final confrontation didn't happen in the dark woods. It happened in the full, unforgiving light of day, right in the heart of Red Hollow Ranch. They knew Blackwood would have to come back. The documents were his doom, and he was a cornered animal. They didn't have to hunt him. They just had to wait. They brought the wounded Pete back to the ranch house, where Annie, with a surgeon's steady hand, cleaned and bandaged his wound. The Wilson twins took up positions in the hayloft of the barn, their rifles covering the long road from town. Coulter and Annie stood on the front porch, the tin box resting on the railing between them. They were no longer two strangers circling each other's secrets. They were partners, forged in fire and truth. The ghosts of the past had finally been laid to rest, replaced by a fierce, shared purpose. Just after noon, they saw the dust cloud on the horizon. 3 riders, Blackwood and his remaining men. They were coming back, not for a stealthy attack, but for an open assault. Desperation had made him bold. They rode into the yard and reined in their horses, a tense standoff across 20 yards of open ground. "Last chance, Hayes," Blackwood shouted, his face a mask of fury. "Give me the box, and I'll let you live. I'll even let you keep your pathetic little farm." "The lies are over, Blackwood," Coulter called back, his voice ringing with authority. He held up the packet of documents. "It's all here. Everything. Your whole corrupt enterprise is finished." Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Documents can be burned. Witnesses can be silenced. This is the frontier, Hayes. The only law here is the man with the fastest gun." He reached for his pistol, but Annie was faster. In one fluid motion, she snatched a rifle Coulter had leaned against the porch rail, cocked it, and fired. The shot wasn't aimed at Blackwood. It was aimed at the rope holding a heavy block and tackle above the barn door, a piece of equipment they used for lifting hay bales. The rope snapped. The heavy iron block plummeted downwards, striking the ground with a thunderous crash right in front of Blackwood's horse. The animal screamed in terror, rearing up and throwing Blackwood from the saddle. Before his men could react, 2 more shots boomed from the hayloft. The Wilson twins fired with deadly accuracy, not to kill, but to disarm. The thugs' rifles were shot from their hands, clattering uselessly to the ground. They wasted no time, spurring their horses and fleeing back down the road they came. Blackwood was alone, sprawled in the dust, his power vanished. Coulter walked down the porch steps, his boots crunching on the gravel, and stood over the man who had destroyed 2 families. He didn't have a weapon in his hand. He didn't need one. "It's over," Coulter said. Blackwood scrambled to his feet, his fine suit covered in dirt, his face contorted with hate. He lunged at Coulter, pulling a concealed knife from his boot. He never made it. Annie stepped off the porch, silent as a cat. She moved with the same impossible grace she used with a scythe. She intercepted Blackwood's lunge, using his own momentum against him, and in a move that was both brutal and beautiful, disarmed him and sent him crashing to the ground again, his arm twisted at an agonizing angle. She stood over him, her face impassive, the toe of her worn boot pressing on his throat. Justice had arrived at Red Hollow Ranch. 6 months later, the world was green again. Winter snows had melted, and the fields Coulter and Annie had planted together were showing the first tender shoots of a new season. Herbert Blackwood was gone, his empire dismantled by the proof from Sarah's tin box. The territorial government, faced with undeniable evidence of his corruption, had no choice but to act. His land grabs were nullified, his political allies disgraced. Justice, it turned out, could sometimes be found in the paragraphs of an old legal document, especially when backed by a few good people with rifles. Red Hollow Ranch was safe. The easement for the railroad was negotiated on fair terms, bringing a new prosperity to the valley without destroying its soul. On a bright spring morning, under the shade of the old cottonwood tree, the whole community gathered. Tom Henderson was there, and the Martinez family, and all the other ranchers who had stood with them. Pastor William stood before them, his Bible open. Coulter stood waiting, his heart full. He wasn't wearing his old wedding ring anymore. He had given it to Pete, now fully recovered and beaming like a proud father, for safekeeping. It was a part of his history, but no longer the anchor of his present. Then Annie appeared on the porch. She wore a simple white dress she had sewn herself, and in her hair was the wooden comb he had carved for her. She walked toward him, not as a stranger or a hired hand, but as his partner, his equal, his future. Their vows weren't flowery. They were simple, strong promises, spoken by two people who had seen the worst of the world and had chosen to build something good in its place. They exchanged rings, simple gold bands that shone in the Montana sun. Their love hadn't grown in a peaceful pasture. It had been forged in the crucible of lies, secrets, and violence. It was stronger for it. They had saved the ranch, yes, but in the process, they had saved each other. That night they stood on the porch, looking out at the land that was now theirs in every sense of the word. The past was at peace, the future was an open field, and the whispering wheat told a new story, not of ghosts and grief, but of resilience, of justice, and of a love that had grown where even the strongest men had fallen. It was a story that would become a legend in Red Hollow, a reminder that sometimes the most broken ground is where the most beautiful things take root. If this story of love, loss, and long-hidden secrets kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that subscribe button. The tales of courage and justice are far from over, and you won't want to miss the storm that's coming next.